Should evangelicals be banned from evangelizing Indigenous peoples? Nope, and here's why.
Alright, welcome back to Vagrant Sam. I'm Vagrant Sam, and today we're going to be talking about this clip that you just saw in the intro, where Ross Burns responded to a story from a little while ago where there was an Indigenous community that was actually calling for religious proselytization or missionaries to be actually banned in their community. Ross was definitely against the idea of banning that type of speech, and GE, Godless Engineer, actually was for that actually being banned. And they had a debate about that, and I had a response to this whole story when it did come out a few weeks ago now. I haven't seen the debate. I have seen Ross's video. I have some thoughts on it. I had some thoughts at the time, and now I've got time to actually sit down and stand up and do a video on it. So we are going to do that today. So let's carry on.
First, you're probably wondering why there's now a bookcase in my background. Well, I was recently made aware of a made-up Pew Research study that said all important YouTube videos have bookshelves in their background. So I figured, why not give it a try and see if I become more important?
Check. Let's go.
So recently there's been a considerable amount of controversy over the question, should evangelicals be allowed or banned from evangelizing Indigenous peoples? But as you can probably tell, I think a proposed ban of that nature is a bad, no good, really dumb, awful idea.
So, one thing I will say is that based on the way the question is being formed and the way the question is being proposed at the moment, it is very easy to come to the idea that, yes, a ban would be a little bit silly. So, what I would suggest is that the question potentially be reformed. Now, the issue I have with the way it's being presented here, and it may have been presented this way by GE and by the news and by the online discussion broadly, so this isn't a specific criticism of Ross Burns here, but the question is not should evangelicals be banned from spreading the gospel or preaching or sharing their religion, which we're going to get a little bit more into as we get further into this discussion. What it is, or what I believe the question should be formed as, is do Indigenous communities have the right to have freedom from speech that they feel is not productive for their communities? That, I think, is a question that is a little less easy to come to a answer of, well, no, they don't have the right to be free from certain types of speech if they feel that that's not what is in their best interest. And that's actually how I pass this actual question, is not does someone have the right to a certain type of speech, but does another group have right to not participate or not be subjected to a certain type of speech? And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail as we go to the 4 points that Ross brings up in his video. So let's carry on.
No government should restrict the religious freedom of anyone to proselytize anyone. We should be free to advocate for what we think the best idea out there is.
And so this is where we get to the first big part of what I think is misleading the question into an area that's not actually relevant in the discussion, and that is, when should a government have the right to restrict someone's speech? Broadly speaking, in Western cultures, we believe that everyone has a right to free speech, whether that's something that is enshrined in the Constitution in something like America, or whether it's something that is not explicitly stated in somewhere like Australia. Now, in this case, I don't believe that's actually the question that's being asked. The question isn't whether or not someone can express their beliefs in appropriate and in public areas. It's, do people have a right to go into communities that are not their own and be platformed in those communities? My answer is no, that no one has that inalienable right in a community outside their own, in spaces that are not general public spaces. Now, what I don't want to be in this video is to be getting into specific things to do with native title and who gets what rights and what is done on Indigenous land and Indigenous communities. What I want to talk about is sort of broad ideas and how I see it, rather than what is legally right or wrong. I want to discuss what is ethically or morally acceptable or unacceptable in my point of view, and the reasons I have for that. So I would say that Indigenous communities, they do have a right to self-determination in who they allow to be platformed within their communities. That's not to say that this speech is restricted necessarily, but when it comes to a corporate importing of ideas and certain types of speech, I think no is a fair answer. That hey, no, we don't think you should have a platform here, and let's carry on. So I'm going to say that with point one, I disagree with your with the way you've framed it, and think that it should be framed a little bit more with the community in mind rather than the rights of the preachers and rights of the missionaries. We need to think about the rights of the individuals and communities that are actually being affected. And so that's why I sort of fall on the opposite side to yourself on whether or not that's something that is relevant in terms of making a decision here. So
no modern missionary organization within evangelicalism has any interest in forcing our beliefs on someone else. A good example I might use is if tomorrow morning 2 lovely Jehovah's Witnesses knock on my door and they want to tell me about the wonders of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, if I were to tell them, no thanks, and they were to knock me down and charge into my house and set up shop in my kitchen, I'm calling the cops. So no one is talking about forced entry or harassment or trespassing or defacing of cultural property. Governments can and should protect people's right to their own estate.
So here's something that we agree on, that governments should protect people's estates and cultural artifacts and things like that. I think part of the reason why perhaps you disagree with the idea that it should be banned that people have a platform in these locations is perhaps because you don't fully appreciate the effect that missionaries have on the Indigenous culture and Indigenous heritage. So going back to your example of not being able to barge into your lounge room and then have the right to a platform where someone can, tell. So going back to your example of someone not having the right to go into your lounge room and preach the gospel to you forcibly, I don't see that is not relevant here, that these communities are not the same as the communities that we might find in a Western town or Western city, and that Indigenous communities have a lot more of a open and a lot more of a communal interaction on a day-to-day basis. And so that actually having or feeling like you've got the right to go into those communities and to I don't want to say manipulate, because I know that comes with a whole lot of associations, but try to modify the behaviors and the beliefs of those people within their own spaces, it does get dangerously close, and for me does actually cross the line to feeling like you've got the right to be within their space and within their personal areas in order to change their minds or to change their behaviors. And I think that's something that they can actually or should actually have the right to protect and say, no, this is not a space for that type of behavior. We as a community, we don't want that in our spaces. There's a lot of examples of it, the way Indigenous people interact that is not the same as the way we interact outside of their culture. And that's definitely something that everyone should be sensitive about whenever they're interacting with people that are not within their own personal in-group. And that type of understanding, I think, can only breed more empathy and better interactions with people.
Secondly, all culturally held beliefs, value sets, and worldviews are not equal. Some worldviews are better than other worldviews. Are we really going to say that a culture that does not value women is as good as a culture that does value women? What about a culture that prizes the scientific method as an epistemological tool versus superstition and tradition?
So here's where I think that we differ here, in that I think I want to separate the idea of culture and morality. Morality is about outcomes and about how we treat each other and about how we look out for welfare of ourselves and those around us. Culture is a way that we express ourselves and express our identity. Now, there is not a necessary link between a particular culture and a particular moral standard. Moral standard is a tricky word to use when we're talking Christian, but let me rephrase that as a desirable moral compass. Again, morality in Christianity is really tough to talk about because it's got so much baggage on the different words you use. Anyway, the point being that a particular cultural expression is not necessarily tied to the moral output of that expression. And I think that there are ways that cultures can actually adopt better morality without having to adopt the cultures of groups that may have been better in particular moral values, such as, you say, the way we treat women, the way we treat elders, the way we treat children, all those types of things. I don't think there's an imperative to shift someone's culture to shift their morality. We can actually do one without the other. We can actually do one without the other and separate those two ideas and still have the types of outcomes that you would suggest are a benefit when it comes to importing Christianity into another culture. I think that can be done without Christianity. So on this point, I'm going to have to disagree with your conclusion again, but hopefully you can understand why I'm disagreeing with it. And let's keep going.
Now, thirdly, a ban on proselytization is self-refuting. Now, what do I mean by self-refutation? Consider the statement that all general statements are false. So a statement like, all Italians talk with their hands like this, is false, because all general statements are false. Let's consider another statement. All general statements are false. Is that a general statement? Must be false.
So the self-refutation thing, I think that comes from having a malformed and a ill-conceived question. And I think the fact that the question at the start of this video that you've done allows you to use this point is more a lack of rigor in forming the question and forming the discussion. So that's part of the reason why at the start I was very clear to say, hey, I don't think this is about whether or not a particular type of speech should be banned. I think it's a discussion about whether or not a platform is inherently available to all people in all places, regardless of the context or the culture. I think at that point, that question is not self-refuting because it doesn't suffer from their all Italians speak like this. And instead it's about a specific time, specific place, and those things can be discussed. And the merits of each of those points within the question can actually be established and discussed more robustly than, hey, should we ban evangelism in rural communities, banning ideas? I think the key here is to have very specific, clear questions, and I think this circumstance is able to be expressed in a much clearer, much more specific question than the one that you've used to illustrate the self-refutation. And I think if that's the case, I would prefer that we steelman the question so we can discuss it rather than dismissing it because it's not a well-formed question. Hopefully that makes sense.
So far, I have not heard any logical explanation of why proselytizing someone in the first world is different than proselytizing someone in the third world.
I understand that there's no intent behind the language that you've used here, but I would gently rebuke the idea that you would present Indigenous Australians as being a third world people, because the fact of the matter is they are not living in a third world, they're living in Australia. Now, without getting caught up in the definitions of first world versus second world and import versus export and all that sort of stuff, I think we need to understand that a lot of the disadvantages and a lot of the reasons why you might have used the term third world are actually indicative of the way they're treated by their own society and their own country, thanks to those of us that have colonized after they took possession of the land 40, 60, 80,000 years ago. That's just me being a little bit picky and maybe be a little bit more sensitive around that type of language, because it is, something that I think, particularly us Australians, when we're talking about Indigenous Australians, we need to be very aware of the effects that our decisions have on the people that were here first, and the Indigenous peoples and the traditional owners of the land. So just a little gentle rebuke. I understand there was no intent there, but I just wanted to put that piece in.
And finally, I'd like to give a specific example of when evangelism of an Indigenous tribe really did work. My favorite example is the missionary work of the Richardson family in the 1960s and following of the Sawi people of Western New Guinea. For a vast amount of generations, the Sawi people were not the kind of people you'd bring home to meet your parents. One of their prized virtues was actually the ability to deceive one's enemy, to be treacherous. They thought that Judas was actually the hero of the gospel. They were a head-hunting, cannibalistic war tribe, constantly at war with the sub-factions within themselves. They were riddled with hepatitis and malaria and high infant mortality and had no way of themselves to combat these things.
And so here we have what you're presenting as an example of, well, the gospel is actually a force for good and can actually improve outcomes for people. Now, the issue I would have with this particular example is not that it's a bad example in terms of the outcomes versus the starting position of the Sawi people. It's the fact that influencing people when you threaten them is not particularly difficult, shall we say. So when you go to a people and say, hey, you understand that if you die, this is what happens, and God is this just yet loving God, and so if you accept him and if you adopt this culture or you adopt this belief system, then you'll be saved. To me, that's not extraordinary. And I struggle with the idea that maybe religion was good for people, particularly as we were forming civilization, as we started to extend our smaller community groups from immediate family into larger communities in the agricultural revolution. But I'm not sure that we're still there. I'm not sure that we can't use more broad and more general statements of morality and ethics to actually convince people to behave better. I'm not sure that we need to resort to, hey, God's going to get you if you don't accept him, accept Jesus, and tacitly accept all the laws and all the cultural norms that come with that. One thing in particular that I'll point out is, while you do focus on the fact that it did reduce things like murder, violence, and potentially the spread of disease, I think that's implicit by the fact that you mentioned hepatitis being quite common before the missionaries started, is that Christianity, from someone who doesn't believe, now this is something that not every Christian likes to participate in, but let's think in the head of someone that doesn't believe in Christianity, and let's look at the things that Christianity actually brings to a group of people. You've already covered all the good things, the idea that don't kill, don't rob, don't steal, improving outcomes overall. But I feel like we also need to consider what are the bad things. And for me, I consider the bad things like original sin, the idea that people are inherently evil or inherently broken, and the idea that God can actually judge you based on your thoughts and feelings, and the fact that you're never good enough and you need a sacrifice of blood to actually cleanse you. And those things I feel are vastly underestimated in general, in terms of how damaging and how belittling and how dehumanizing the Christian religion can be to people. And it devalues their time in the here and now, with the focus of, hey, you're going to get rewards in the afterlife. For that reason, and because we know it is possible to actually influence people through things like policy and education and improving healthcare outcomes, that those should be the focus in the 20th century, 21st century, not religion. That we should be turning to support services, and we should be turning to things that are more tangible in order to influence people, because at the end of the day, religion is something that can change. People can be converted, deconverted, a new religion can come along, and if they're accepting things based on how they feel rather than what can be demonstrated and shown to be evident through the scientific process, people are more likely to accept things that aren't as good for their outcomes as they might appear in the first place. And I'll point back to things in Christianity itself, the implicit, at the very best case, the implicit idea of men being leaders and women being followers in relationships and in the church, and different denominations make that more explicit. Particularly when talking about Indigenous Australians, it's typically Pentecostal denominations, and they are a little bit more patriarchal than, say, your general churches in terms of the way they teach that theology. And so when that's the cost, that doesn't need to be paid. We don't need to use the vehicle of Christianity to bring benefits to people. I think we can safely say, well, you know what? Giving them the right to have a platform in these communities is not necessarily something that is inherent or something that is not worth addressing, in terms of saying, hey, guys, maybe you don't go to them, let them come to you. You can have your speech, you can have your meetings, you can have your opinions, you can practice your religion in all these other ways. You just can't go and inject it into a community that you're not a part of. And I think that's fair. and I think that's reasonable. So, all right, I think I'm going to leave it there. I am starting to sweat still because it is still hot in Australia, and I'm in a room without air conditioning or windows. I think I want to sort of make a concise point at the end, and that is, if we are truly concerned about the welfare of others, and we use the gospel or we use Christianity as an excuse for going in and actually interacting with these communities, I think that changing someone's religion, changing someone's belief set, that kind of needs to take a back seat to some of the very real and very wicked problems that face Indigenous peoples in Australia. Now, I do apologise, I've just accidentally used a policy term there. So wicked problems in terms of policy are problems that are very difficult in terms of being immediately addressed by a simple solution. They are things that are typically both complicated and complex, in that they are both opaque in the way things affect outcomes and make changes, and they have lots of steps that need to be analysed and understood in order to make a change. And closing the gap for Indigenous people is one of those things. Because of that, I think allowing undue influence from corporations, I'm going to call them corporations because, again, we are talking about Pentecostal churches, and they do act as corporations more than they do charities in my point of view. But having them being able to put resources and finances into influencing these communities without actually giving proper consideration to the cultural values and the cultural influences and the history that is going into it, I think that's something that's worth going, hey, stop. We need to be better at interacting with our Indigenous people. What is really sad is that some of this is actually resulting in Indigenous artifacts being burnt, because the Indigenous people who are being converted are being taught that their history and that their traditions are things that are from Satan and of the devil, and they're evil spirits, and they need to be removed from their lives and burnt, which really sadly reminds me of the days of book burning in the church, and when they were afraid of other knowledge and other influences. And I think that the fact that that's happening in 2019, and I'm not sure if I saw any articles in 2020, but there's no reason to believe that's stopped necessarily. I think that's a real important wake-up call in terms of, hey, when it comes to having Pentecostal missionaries or charismatic missionaries, Christian missionaries going into these places, I think the current ways that they're interacting are inappropriate and unfair to the Indigenous people in Australia, and we need to give them the right to choose to have space and have freedom from that message. And in this case, let's remember, it is the elders from a community that have asked for this ban. This is not a ban that is being asked for all communities throughout Australia. This is a Indigenous community who has said, we want this to stop, and I think they have the right, and I think they should have the power to enforce that desire for people to stop coming to their people and stop coming to their communities to influence and to change and to impact a community that they themselves are, like the people that are coming into the communities, the missionaries, they're not part of the community. So why do they get a vote? So that's my thoughts. I hope that made sense. I hope that was coherent. I hope that even if you don't understand, I hope that even if you don't agree with my conclusions, that you understand why I'm there. If that's not the case, please leave a comment down below and tell me where I've been inconsistent or where I've been incoherent. Ross, if you've listened to this, I hope that I gave your arguments the respect that they deserve. I understand that you probably, no, I'm not going to say probably, I understand and I believe that you are coming from a place of true love and respect, and that your passion for the gospel is what's leading you. I just think that when it comes to interacting with people that don't share our beliefs, we need to set ourselves into a mindset of, well, what is the right thing to do if my assumptions are not part of the discussion? And I think your conclusion is only coherent if the gospel is true, and until the gospel can be demonstrated to be true to people that don't believe, then it's not a compelling reason, I think, to infringe on people's right to be free from speech as much as people are free to have speech. And again, leave a comment down below if you disagree. Hopefully this came across in the spirit it was intended, which is friendly discourse. And everyone, thank you for watching. Hit the like button if you liked it, hit the dislike if you didn't like it and I screwed things up. I've tried to be very sensitive and tried to be very understanding of Indigenous values. I'm not an Indigenous Australian. I do not identify as Indigenous Australian, so my opinion is obviously my own and is not reflective of what their opinion is, and their right to autonomy and their right to self-determination as the traditional custodians of the land. So hopefully I've done my best. It's a tricky subject, and I really strongly recommend anyone who is interested in it to actually go and do some reading, because there's lots of really good articles about this problem. It's not just constrained to that particular story of that particular group that wanted to have their missionaries banned, but it's pretty common across Australia, Western Australia, Northern Territory. There's a real tension there between the right to people's practicing their religion when it's a religion that is active in going out and proselytising, and the right for people to be able to carry on traditional values and traditional practices and rituals without having that constantly challenged by quite large and relatively powerful corporations.